Welcome back to Revelation On Demand podcast dedicated to bringing you revelation from the Bible. I'm your host, Justin D. Myers, and I'm joined today, as usual, by Mr. Chris Hess. How you doing, buddy?
You know what? All things considered, I'm going to tell you a similar answer every day, but that's because I have a good attitude, is I'm still doing pretty great. I'm really appreciative of the life I have right now. Good or bad moments, it's floating, and, I'm going. So I'm really always thankful for God for that.
Yeah, I'm doing all right myself. It's been a rough week. I didn't get everything done that I needed to get done, but we're here now. We're ready to roll. So, last time we started into the book of Amos, which was one of the earlier prophets, one of the lesser known prophets. So this guy tends to get kind of glazed over usually when people are reading the Bible, and I can understand why. It's not particularly one of the easiest books to read, especially when it's talking about all this damnation on ancient people who we don't really have that much of a tie to anymore. That can be really hard to
conceptualize and get a realistic idea of.
Yeah. I don't know the word, to relate to it, that sort of thing. That's what I wanted to say.
Yes, sir.
So, we're going to continue on this. He's one of the prophets, and he there's a little bit of prophecy in here, I guess, where he's talking about Israel being destroyed, and then, of course, there was not destroyed, but taken over, and then Assyria came in. We'll go into that more in detail when we get to the end of the chapter. These are pretty short chapters, so if the episodes are a little lighter than normal, that would be because of that. We do our best to study as much as we can for each of these chapters that we're doing, and we try to make sure that we bring you guys as much detailed information as we can. Again, if you have any suggestions or questions or comments, feel free to contact us. Shall we continue into this? We're in Amos 2, where he's going to start talking about judgment being pronounced on the neighbors of Israel.
Yes, and just one thing real quick before we start going into that, and then I start reading the scripture for us. This has got a lot of, as hard as it could be to be relative to modern day people, this is still a very prominent subject in the Middle East, in the specific nations that are existent to this day, if not regions. So, we went over that a little bit last episode, where this does have to do a little bit with some of those conflicts you see in modern day with Israel and the surrounding countries. We're not going to name anyone specifically, but yeah, so try to apply some of that if it starts to become a little bit complicated when you start hearing about ancient kingdoms, and try to apply that to maybe some of their philosophy and tactics that they do apply today, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise. You're going to see a lot of more relative sources of inspiration for how these places were formed and how they are led. And as Christians today, how we can apply a similar adaptation or even gain inspiration from someone that did see the greater light in everything in a time of sheer darkness, especially in ancient days. So I'm going to get started on Amos 2. Did you have anything to say before I get started?
Nope, that's good. We'll just dive into the text, and then we'll start to dissect it as we go through it.
All right. So, starting with verse 1. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Moab, even for 4, I will not relent. Because he burned to ashes the bones of Edom's king. I will send fire on Moab that will consume the fortresses of Kerioth. Moab will go down in great tumult. Amid war cries and the blast of the trumpet, I will destroy her ruler and kill all her officials with him, says the Lord. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Judah, even for 4, I will not relent, because they have rejected the law of the Lord and have not kept his decrees, because they have been led astray by false gods, the gods their ancestors followed. I will send fire on Judah that will consume the fortresses of Jerusalem.
All right, so we see here that he brings judgment on 2 of Israel's neighbors. Judah would be kind of this partnering neighbor, definitely part of Israel for most of its history, but often they try to also be their own entity. But first, we start with Moab, which was one of the neighbors. And if you're not familiar with Jewish culture and the practices at this time, the bones of the dead would be put in these bone boxes called ossuaries. And so this would be the correct way to honor your dead. You wrap them, you speed up the decaying process, and then you place their bones in ossuaries to be put in their house tombs, or these sort of the tunnels and caves where all these dead were placed in these small bone boxes for their ancestors, for their predecessors to come by and honor them later. So Moab really they destroyed a lot of these family tombs when they came through, and they just desecrated the dead. So
Of course.
Amos is saying here that they're going to be burned to ashes, and one of the common practices for whitewashing walls was to use a kind of lime powder that was made from burning shells and animal bones down to ash. So it was talking about burning the bones of the people of Moab down to ash so that they could be, desecrated in much the same way that they desecrated the dead of the Israel people that they came in and they did these terrible things to the honored dead is what they're being judged for here.
Might I say that is awful
good.
crafty. That's like the most crafty way you could desecrate someone is, hey, we're gonna use you as paint. Sort of.
Yeah, no, it's literally that's like from here's your. It's like, I guess in modern American culture, it'd be like digging up a grave, burning the body, and then mixing the ash into paint. Then some people are like, yeah,
core idea
cremated, so just
right.
Yeah, no. that brings up the weird practices that we have in America, where we have like you could get turned into ash and then compressed into a diamond, like yeah, okay. Weird burial practices. But anyways, that's kind of the idea. They would use the whitewash. It's just it's kind of a plaster, like a paint, I guess, and they use it to make things very white, to make it cleaner, because they didn't have access to things like drywall and wallpaper. So
sure,
that was a much later invention. So Kirioth is referring to a location in Moab, and scholars aren't exactly sure where exactly this is. So it's just referring to an area in Moab when it's talking about Kirioth. Carrying on, as it switches to talking about Judah, we can see that Amos is going from talking about enemy nations or allied nations or nearby nations, where they're talking about how these nations did terrible things to other nations around them, more specifically Israel and Judah. But as we see him shift focus to his people, we see that it's less about what they did as a nation to other nations, and it's more about what they did against God, because they are God's people. They have God's law. They're supposed to follow God's law. So now Amos is turning from crimes against humanity to crimes against God when he's talking about the people of Israel and Judah.
Yeah. I've always seen, like, when we see that in the ancient world, like philosophically speaking, that you could adapt the idea that these generations are so much closer to our origins in Adam and Eve and the initial
Mm,
creation that the rules are going to be a little bit more strict because the descending, if God is omnipotent and he's all knowing at the same time, he knows how their sins are going to affect the future generations as time flows. So when he sees them imminently turning into these horrible things and destroying each other and sinning against their brothers and sisters, he sees how that's going to work out for us, even thousands
mm,
of years later. And that's why we see a little bit more of the judgment, the damnation. It'd be like, and not to dive into like any family structure, but it'd be almost like, okay, my older brother had to go through it first, and or like when we had the bad kid in the family, and then I learned from those mistakes, and then I'm passed down generations. It's kind of like hand me downs. Like if your original ancestors were to meet you today, would they judge you or would they be praising you more so than the ones that could have potentially affected your life way back when? So I mean, that's philosophically, that's some adaptation we have, because a lot of the universe is imminent. We talk about that on Revelation on Demand. Is the book of Revelation is imminent. So nothing is set in stone, dead
mm,
set. You're always going to have choices in life. You're going to have these things that can happen, that there's freedom of will that God bestows on us. But at the same time, if there's a format, a template
mm.
where God's plan is going to match up more so with what is intended, he's going to see how you deviate from that and how it hurts yourself, ultimately hurting other people, or vice versa.
Mm.
And that's gonna not gonna be a good thing. So you're gonna receive some judgment, some parenting from the All Father or from God Himself, and he might have to put his foot down and be like, "Y'all are really not doing this right."
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So he is referencing there in the end. He's pointing towards Jeremiah and Isaiah, where it starts to talk about that final judgment. So as Chris was talking about how there's concurrent judgment where we pay we pay the consequences of our sin right now. And then there's also talking about the ultimate conclusion, which is a lot of what Amos is talking about. It's not just, oh, this is going to happen soon because you're not following God's ways. This is the final payment you are going to be making because you're not following God's ways. And in the places in Isaiah and Jeremiah he's referencing, we're talking about how there were going to be people in Israel, the people who were chosen, who would refuse to see the error in their ways, kind of a lot like the Sadducees and Pharisees of the time when Jesus came to walk among us. They just would not see how they were wrong, and we can see that ultimate condemnation comes at the final judgment. Is there anything else you wanted to add, or shall we move on to the next section?
No, I mean, as far as like a closed loop system, if we're supposed to explain an everlasting universe and an ever powerful God who ultimately knows what's going to happen before it even happens, and he could see the result of anything and everything, we got to be able to see it in our human minds and our human spirits, which are not limited, but we have to be able to be knowledgeable on it, or at least draw an idea from it for us to understand it. I feel like as far as that goes, there's stuff going on as you do it. There's ultimately going to be an ending to it. That's the reality. We all are born, who are here that we could talk to right now. We all end up leaving at some point, and that is imminent. That is permanent. That's what happens. It's a closed loop system. Like I said, I think that ties it in a little better to make it more understandable. So I don't mind reading on
All right.
into
Do you want me to
verse
read, or
6.
do you want to read?
Oh, I'm all for reading.
I can read for you if your voice is okay. Yeah.
No, I'm good. My voice is all good today. I promise. All right. Verse 6, starting at verse 6. This is what the Lord says: For 3 sins of Israel, even for 4, I will not relent. They sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground and deny justice to the oppressed. Father and son use the same girl and so profane my holy name. They lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. In the house of their God they drink wine taken as fines. Yet I destroyed the Amorites before them. Though they were tall as the cedars and strong as the oaks, I destroyed their fruit above and their roots below. I brought you up out of Egypt and led you 40 years into the wilderness to give you the land of the Amorites. Huh.
Oh. So here we see Amos is finally getting around to Israel and telling them what he's really wanted to tell them. We see that this section is focusing on social injustice and the exploitation of the poor and needy. And we see him first say that, basically, right at the beginning, and then he gives us a little more description of what's actually happening. And then that last little section, we see how, you guys are acting like this, but this is what God had done for you. So it's kind of one of those things where he's like, you guys are really, kind of taking God's name for vain. Yeah, you're bratty. You were given this land. You were given the right over this land, and look what you've done. Like you're not acting the way you're supposed to. So ultimately, Israel's decision to turn from God would end in their military defeat. And at the time of Amos, we're looking at a more specific time in history, but we see this again and again throughout the Bible, where Israel finds God, follows God, everything goes good. And then at some point they forget that they're following God and they fall into this sinful ways and doing and worshiping wrong gods and stuff like that. And then God brings down some consequences on that. And then that usually ends up being the catalyst, the pressure that brings Israel back around to, oh, this is our God. We need to follow this God. We need to do what this God says. So we see this cycle, and it's kind of interesting that we ourselves can find ourselves going through a similar cycle where we feel really close to God and we're following God and we're reading the book every day and, we're doing all the right things. And then we can go through a season where we kind of forget what we're doing. We maybe set up some false idols and then, oh gosh, we hit some consequences from whatever the sin was. And then we go, oh, then we completely come back around and say, oh, we need to follow God. We need to continue doing what we're doing. We get back into that season. So we can see this play out on a national scale or on an individual scale in our own lives.
Oh, I would definitely agree with that.
So we see them.
False idols, replacing things in your life that you know are good and putting in something of your desires that you know are not going to work out or are bad, and then it ends up misleading you into these greater ideas. Now, the influence of sin can definitely do that too and misguide, especially those in youth, but ultimately, everyone has a greater idea at some point to know. I would argue everyone at some point has a greater idea to know when you do something, whether it's going to be bad or good, or whether the intentions are bad or good. Everyone knows how to draw the line of morality, even if you lost your mind to a certain point. There's a little click there, I think, at some point, not speaking from experience here, where you go, oh, okay, yeah, morally speaking, even if I can't pronounce that, I don't think this is a good idea, or I know I was doing wrong. It's just admission of guilt versus following the way that you should be doing something and that guilt doesn't hit. It's like a basic concept that we as humans deviate from because we want to explore new ideas, and that can be a dangerous field when we become obsessed with it and we let that replace our key essential morals or our key essential ideas throughout our lives that we know are better. If we know better, why are we doing against it? You should be using your experience to help protect you, not necessarily saying that no one ever needs to take a risk. No one ever needs to find out what the other stuff is, but you got to bring in all of your arsenal of everything you've learned so far or everything that you have morally to back you up. Check yourself. I'm going to quote a rapper here. Check yourself before you wreck yourself. Really. Bring in what you got.
Very good. Very good. Get that 90s reference in. Anyways, so he started going into more detail as he was talking through that. Now, slavery was a big thing back in these times, but Israel had rules about slavery, and slavery that Israel was supposed to practice was more of an indentured servitude where this person owes you money for whatever reason, so you are giving them the opportunity to work that debt off. Now, what Israel ended up starting to do was more what what the abuse of slavery becomes, where they weren't letting people just pay off their debts. They were owning people. They were keeping people down in slavery, and these were lifetime terms. They were not just these short 6-year periods normally for people to work off a debt that they owe. So we see that is one way that Israel was not following the rules. Now, this next one is a little harder to talk about, but the sexual relations to the same girl. It could refer to prostitution, which again would be against the rules of Israel, or it could be even talking about incest, which again is against the rules of Israel. There are specific laws in Deuteronomy, Leviticus that specifically speak against these practices, selling the body for sex, or incest for that matter. So we can see, again, here's another law that Israel is disrespecting. Now, all this has to do with the fact that Israel is not acting as holy as they should be. God set these laws up. If you study Leviticus and Deuteronomy, God gave Israel these laws to set them aside from the other nations around them. When they start doing these things, such as, abusing the poor and needy in these ways, or abusing each other in these ways, they are acting much like the other nations around them that didn't have the same moral code that Israel is supposed to have. So it's a lot like they were hypocrites, basically. They say they serve this God, but they won't follow his rules. So how does that make them any different than the people around them? And we're supposed to be holy, which means set aside. So this is just them not being holy, and this is what God and Amos are talking about. They are reflecting poorly upon God because they claim to be God's people, but they're not acting like God's people. So their actions are speaking contrary to their words.
Yeah, I mean, if let's say this entire region, this entire area of the world at its time were all college students, if every nation was embodied as a singular person and they're all college students, it's going to be that classic excuse. It's going to be that classic excuse of, well, everyone else is doing it, or, yeah, but rules are meant to be broken. It's like, no. These rules are in place because someone who knew darn well better than you do, and you probably will ever do, set them in place. And that's because God put them in there. And it's like, it's simple. You want to desecrate, you want to degrade yourself. Do you want to fall short of the mark for the rest? Do you want to end up causing a fatal incident where you collapse as a person? Or are you going to set yourself aside as a leader? Are you going to set yourself aside as a behaving person and know what it means to be logical? And in this case, that logic would be just following the spiritual law, following God's law. He sets them out because it makes sense. Why do we always feel bad when we break any of God's law? Because it's not natural and it's not healthy for you. It is natural in a way. Sin is natural in a way. It's all part of us as people because we live in a fallen world. But there's got to be a point where you look at it and be like, you know what? I am so much more relieved now that I separated myself from that. Or that I never did it in the first place. Sure, you might be curious of what it's like, but, even taking that first step could lead a long journey into a place you're trapped in if you don't recollect yourself and if you didn't decide to even think of what God's law was in the first place. That's a big struggle for a lot of people. And that's part of this world is it's so taxing. You could end up in servitude for something that you didn't even know, or an entity that you didn't even know. I'm going to argue. Like we talk about Moloch, we talked about these big spiritual evil influences in the world that are so much more powerful than we conceptualize if we choose to live our life in sin. With God's backing and the Lord's backing, you're completely fine. Just, you don't even have to separate yourself from it. If you want to know what it is, confront it. But confront it from God's side, not from your own side, because Lord knows getting caught between that sandwich is not going to be a healthy one.
Quite right. So, continuing on, talking about clothing taken in pledge. I mean, this is just briefly mentioned in there. This is yet another law that was given in Exodus, where it says, Exodus 22, 26, and 27, if you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you return it to him before the sun sets, for that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? And it shall come about when he cries out for me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. So that is literally, people, the very poor, could give whatever articles of clothing they actually had as a pledge or as, a collateral or I'm trying to think of the word we have for loans today. But anyways, it was made so that, it was a loan. Well, a loan was given, but it was a collateral for the loan. Like, if you don't pay back this loan, then I get to keep this. Now, the poor have nothing else. So if you keep their cloak all night, then they have nothing to help keep the elements off of them, which anyone who does survival stuff knows that exposure can be the quickest way to die in surviving outside. So if you don't give him back his cloak at night, he could very well die, and then he's never going to repay you anyways. But a letter was found in an ancient Judea fortress that attests to a laborer filing a complaint on someone doing this very thing, where he kept his cloth or his clothing as that collateral and never gave it back at night. Now, the common practice was, in the morning they come and give you back their clothing as that collateral, and then they go work. And at some point, hopefully they can pay you back the money that they borrowed to get their clothing back. So,
or work to a certain extent, but if you have no grace in your heart like the Lord, then you're not going to ever end up letting this person pay back, and that might be where that's that involuntary slavery, even though we talk about slaves throughout the Bible and throughout culture as, like in modern-day culture, as what slavery evolved into is a horrible thing. Even the concept in the first place, when you replace the word servitude or serving or working with straight-up slave, that's not a good thing. So, I mean, I can see how that monstrably evolved into that or became that and grew that, and how a lot of people misused it, especially those who were in power more so than the people who were in need. And that, that you can get into that all day. But I'll just say, prospectively, in ancient Israel, that's what was going on.
Yeah, and that very well runs into what it was talking about, the unjust slavery earlier in the thing too. And then it also referred to wine offered as payment. So this was wine that was given as in a very similar manner, where it's like, I don't have any money, but here's this wine that was offered as payment, and then of course they're drinking it in the altar, the temple, or whatever, the place where God's supposed to be. So they're further desecrating God's special area by getting drunk on wine that was used to pay off a debt. Like it just doesn't look good for them.
Yeah, you borrowed $100 from a friend that you shouldn't be hanging out with, and then they come into your parents' house and they're drinking wine and like doing a bunch of sinful behavior right in front of all your family, and you're like, "Oh, God save me." I'm kind of just throwing random examples out there.
Yeah, I gotcha. And then the last section, it talks about the Amorites, which were a group of Canaanites who lived in the land of Israel. And these are the people that like I said in the beginning, these are the people that God, kind of ousted out of the area for the people of Israel. So these Canaanites were referred to as giants. Now, how big they were, it's not for sure known how big they were, but they were even a few inches taller. When most people were 5'5" as an average, it wouldn't take much for them to look like giants in comparison.
So, yeah, Mister. Wait, hold up. I'm gonna pause on this because you've always been a giant to me. I'm 5 foot. I'm 5'7" to 5'8" range, and this dude, if you don't know Justin, is that he is like over 6 feet. Like completely comparatively, like I'm this little dude compared to him. I met him when he was a lineman on the football team. So you're not a Canaanite. I'm just saying, like, prospectively, yeah, it's not going to be that much of a difference, but it would be like, hanging out with your basketball friends when you're running track, or your lineman friends.
Yeah, no, and I'm 6'2", man. Yeah, right. I'm 6'2", and you're honestly a little short for normal people too. But it could very well be that these people were just nominally taller than the Israelite people, because again, average heights were much lower back then. I think now the average height's like 5'9", or it was very much like 5'5" at the time of Israel and the ancient Israelites.
Huh.
So
I'd be rolling, man. Everyone would be shorter
than
me.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, your average height for an ancient Israelite.
I don't know if I can fit through the door, man. I don't know. All right. So this is going to be the last section we read for the day.
Section here.
Yes, and then of course we do the annotations and the technical information and all that good knowledgeable stuff that we all are definitely 100% on the train with, even when things are complicated and technical and we're using a bunch of different terms. Just chill with us for a minute. We're going to make it make sense. 44 episodes in, I have to remind people of this, and I just feel like that because, y'all are a family too. We're all in the kingdom of God. Even those who don't try to associate yourself with us, we're all fam. No worries. We're going to start at verse 11 now.
Yeah. Right.
All right. This is going to start in a quote. I also raised up prophets from among your children and Nazarites from among your youths. Is this not true, people of Israel? Declares the Lord. But you made the Nazarites drink wine and commanded the prophets not to prophesy. Now then, I will crush you as a cart crushes when loaded with grain. The swift will not escape. The strong will not muster their strength, and the warrior will not save his life. The archer will not stand his ground. The fleet-footed soldier will not get away, and the horseman will not save his life. Even the bravest warriors will flee naked on that day, declares the Lord.
Oh boy, we got fire and brimstone coming down here. So,
hey, proportionately, in a much more brutal world, and you had to set yourself aside as a leader, maybe not even as a warrior, but an actual gallant king when you had to roll with an iron fist. If there was no other way to get through to people and we had to praise and worship with an iron fist, maybe that would be proportionately to back then. Nowadays, we could use words, but people acted before they spoke with violence more often than they spoke and tried to reach a reasonable agreement than violence, like, how it is today. But
So we see that God starts talking about this group called the Nazarites, which I don't think we've ever really gone over the Nazarites before. So here we're going to do a little bit of a breakdown. The Nazarites were this group of people in God's people who were kind of set aside to be more special, more holy, more. They had stricter rules. So we see in Scripture there's two permanent Nazarites. Excuse me. Samuel and Samson, which I believe one of those is a king and one of those is a judge. And these guys would permanently adhere to these more strict rules that set them even further aside from the people of God. So normally the service as a Nazarite would be for a period, it'd be for a time, it'd be for a season, however long it would end up. God would call you to that. And so these people were like, no alcohol, no fermented beverages. They would not let those sort of things impair their judgment. So I'm guessing this would also apply to, kind of psychoactives and other drugs. They also did not shave their head or cut their hair. So they were very, very hairy people. I believe it was Samson was the story of the guy who, when his hair was cut, he lost his strength.
Yes.
And that was kind of part of that, where his vow as a Nazarite was not to shave or cut his hair. So as long as he was blessed in following that, he had all that great strength. And then as soon as his lovely lady friend cut his hair, he lost all that strength. But he redeemed himself.
Okay, that's right.
They were not allowed any contact. Yeah, you remember that story? Anyways, and then they were not allowed any contact with the dead, which was just a typical cleanliness law that was passed in, I think it was Deuteronomy, where if you touch a dead body, you were unclean for 7 days or something, and you had to go wash in a spring and do the purification rituals again. And while we today can see that as, it could be a cleanliness thing, it also was that the death was not a part of God that was holy. So, death was something that entered in when the first sin came into the world. Now, I don't know if death as a concept entered in, or, there was no death before that. That's something to debate.
Well, I mean, you could tie those two together, Justin. Like, I was thinking, like, with death back then, if you're talking about disease at the same time for cleanliness, and then you're also talking about curses and everything that it literally impacted the world to what it is today, a lot of people, that's going to create a lot of fear, but it literally carries out itself so much worse than it does nowadays. So if someone died, how do we remove him without personal protective equipment? Just kidding. But how do we remove him or her and not get that disease to become widespread? Because you're talking about entire cities, communities, all these stuff that all it would take would be for one person body, and that entire place could be gone if they're there for overnight, because that's how quick things would proliferate and expand and spread. So, I mean, just take like the bubonic plague,
I'm guessing
for example.
This is a lot where the and I'm thinking this is a lot where undertakers came in. This would probably be the people who regularly, a lot like what we do today. We have, people from the morgue who come in and they handle the dead bodies more often than not. I mean, because there was a time before cities were a big thing, you would have to take care of your own dead, the family. You'd have to go out back and bury the dead on your property. But as cities rose up, they grows this need for a group of people who were specifically designed to handle the dead and take care of all the preparation and all that sort of thing, that depending on what culture you're in, we even have them today. We have undertakers in crematoriums and funeral homes. That's what I'm thinking, the funeral homes today. So I'm guessing this is where that kind of group of people came up, was from this need for everyone else to try and remain as holy as possible, where there was this one person or group of people who were selected to not be as holy, I guess, but just to serve that needed role. And again, that helps with diseases and stuff like that, and keeps stuff from spreading. So
and literally, like we were just talking about too, is like, we all curse stuff aside, like, these people witness the power of God and the power of sin in a way that we can't even imagine. We, as a people today, experience the power of sin and the power of God in ways that they can't even imagine. But it's just all part of cultural recognition. And that's going to be a lot of contrast since this is so far back from us, where every society was led by a religion, more so a religion, or literally what is Christianity, than it is today. So, like, because we don't build all of our structure based off of morality that we find from sources in the Bible, which is much smarter than the average person. Back then, if they had something like the Bible, then, or even when the Torah was to be, it structured their societies, it structured everything that their leadership was, whether you talk about any of these ancient cultures. So it's just like our media today, how that structures how we are, because it's the main source of information and it catches everyone up to speed that knows how to, but it also tends to dictate how things go for us. So, and it's just, it's a day-to-day basis, but it's just interesting how that goes. I'm not comparing, I'm not trying to get political about that, but, comparatively, the Bible set the standard for our country. The Bible set the standard for a lot of people, and it does to this day. And, back then, when you get these societies that are dissolving, even though they've witnessed with their own two eyes the power of God in ways that we can't imagine, they still didn't decide to structure themselves based off of that because they were denying themselves. And I feel like we get a lot of that denial all throughout our human history and our human behavior, that there's just some things that you need to accept for yourself, good or bad. As consequences, as results, as the end of those systems happen, you need to be able to look at it, or even if it's hard to witness, like think about it at some point to close the chapter on that. Because otherwise you end up stuck in a page or on a specific phrase, word, imagery that is going to keep you in one place. And that's, that's not just a matter of strength, but that's also part of spiritual everlasting life, is even things that I'm not saying like it's going to be easy for anyone to do that. I'm saying like, there's going to be a point where everlasting life happens. We live for all eternity, either way. And, all the catacombs and stuff aside, or bone boxes and paints, that we're going to face it at some point. So it's healthy. It's a good idea. And the Lord encourages it. These prophets encourage it all throughout the Bible, and you see respectable figures, including Jesus, look at one thing to the next, even if he has to question it, and then go through with what you have to do. And that's move on, tackle it, whatever you got to do to pull this bad stuff from point A to point B. And sometimes we tend to further get ourselves in the bad stuff because it feels rewarding, where we all should know darn well better that if we just started with the good stuff, took a little bit of patience, or took the best route possible, and that was avoiding too much risk, too much evil, and you get better rewards. It's all part of what's gracious to you, as well as the love from God and the Lord before you. Follow the path of love. Don't follow selfish ambitions unless, I can't even think of a reason why you need to be selfish. You know what I mean? Some people just are. Some ways we just got to learn past that. And maybe sometimes we have to face judgment day before we're like, oh, yeah, I kind of was doing that. So, or collectively, because that tends to happen too. If all these nations were college students and they're all committing to a party that they shouldn't be throwing, what's going on? But I'll just end with that.
All right, that was great. all from the Nazarites. So we see that these people were chosen to be. Yeah, no, I've got a co-host here now. This is Savannah. She's say hi, Savannah. No? Okay. Anyways, we see that these people, much like the prophets, were God's people, carried out or chosen to carry out holy duties, and we see that Israel is causing them to stumble and causing them to do these things that they're not supposed to do, as we've talked, in ad eternum over this episode. Is these people were partaking in things they're not supposed to, and they were corrupted by the people of Israel, just as now they shouldn't have allowed themselves to become corrupted, but it is going to fall on Israel's head. And in about 722 BC, which was a little bit after Amos's time, they would see a military defeat, and the Assyrian Empire would take over. So there you go. And then right there at the end, again, it was making a reference towards the ends of days judgment, which we've been over before, and we talk about a lot on this podcast, how, at the end of days, we will face judgment for the things we do. And Amos was just trying to point out, these are the things you guys are going to face judgment for. So you got anything else to add on that? Should we wrap all this up?
But I think it all wraps up to a question of leadership. If we're getting specific on how Israel was at this time and place, then yes. Prophets are going to go to the source. Our validated prophets all throughout the Bible are going to, and especially Amos, being I'm going to make another rap reference, being the OG, the original guy that, is going to be pointing out this stuff is it's a question of leadership. It's not just hierarchy. It's literally like, I trusted you to, Israel as an individual, I trusted you to lead these other students, to lead these other people into a better place, and not throw a party where you guys were doing this, but maybe a study party and you all behaved and you all had fun anyway. So I don't know. It is a question of leadership. It's a question of collectively what is going on. And you can apply this as an individual, as a nation, as in politics, in personal levels, in spiritual levels. It all amounts to one thing. And that is the way you follow God or not. Other than that, I'm peacing out. Thanks, Justin, as usual. Why don't we wrap this up?
Alrighty. Thank you for listening to Revelation On Demand Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe wherever you catch your podcast from. Please, if you like what we're doing, share this with a friend, family member, or someone from your church. It's a completely private venture and receive no funding from any sources. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please feel free to contact us at revelationondemand@gmail.com. God bless and see you next time.